Imagine a sound that drives you mad. Not a scream, not an explosion, not the grinding of metal. It is the static hiss of radio waves through which a distant, distorted announcer's voice breaks. 1940. The whole world is engulfed in fire. Cities burn in Europe. Tanks grind history beneath their treads, and millions of people are sent to camps. But here, in one of the most remote points on the planet, in Namibia, reigns an absolute, dead silence. Two men sit by a fire in the middle of a desert that looks like the surface of Mars. They are dirty, unshaven, resembling primitive humans. They listen to this crackle of a radio connected to an old truck battery. This voice from the box is their only connection to the civilization that wants to destroy them. They are German scientists, geologists Henno and Hermann Korn. To the world, they are enemies to be arrested and imprisoned in a concentration camp. To the desert, they are foreign organisms, protein bodies to be desiccated and killed. They had a choice: a prison cell with a guaranteed ration of bread, or absolute freedom in a place where a human dies of dehydration in 48 hours. They chose freedom. They decided to play a game with death. Their stake, life. Their opponent, the Namib Desert, the oldest desert on Earth, which has not forgiven mistakes for 55 million years. They fled into nowhere, taking only rifles, philosophy books, and a dog. They thought the war would be over by Christmas. They did not know their voluntary exile would last 900 days. 900 days of hunger, disease, blood, and madness. This is not fiction. This is the real story of how deep you must dig into the sand to preserve human dignity when the whole world has lost its mind. Windhoek, the capital of Namibia, May 1940. The air in the city was heavy, sticky with fear and paranoia. Henno and Hermann, two intellectuals in glasses, sat on the veranda of their house. They were not Nazis, they were not soldiers. They studied rocks. But in the conditions of war hysteria, a passport with a German eagle was a sentence. They were already coming for them. Trucks with soldiers were combing the city. "Remember we joked that if hell breaks loose, we'll go into the desert?" asked Hermann. He nervously turned a cup of cold coffee in his hands. Henno looked at the horizon, where purple mountains dissolved in the heat haze. It was a joke, a geological tall tale. But now it had become the only escape plan. "We will go," said Henno. "We will take Otto, and we will disappear where no army will find us." They had 4 days. 4 days to pack a life into the bed of an old Ford. "What do you take with you, knowing you are going into a death zone?" They acted methodically, like scientists. Water, fuel, spare parts, food, sacks of flour, rice, sugar, canned goods. But they understood this would last a couple of months. After that, they would have to kill to eat. They took luxury items that are more important than bread in the desert. Chocolate to raise blood sugar in a critical moment. Brandy as an anesthetic and antiseptic. Books, Kant, Goethe, geological reference books. Without books, they said, we will turn into baboons. And of course, weapons. The authorities had confiscated all hunting rifles. They only had 2 Luger pistols and an old loose shotgun left. Going against a wild bull or an oryx with a pistol is suicide. But there was no choice. They loaded their dog, Otto, a loyal German shepherd who didn't understand what was happening, but was ready to follow his masters into hell. At dawn, they drove out of the city, winding along dirt roads to throw the police off their trail. Their destination was the Kaiseb Canyon, a giant scar on the planet's body. A labyrinth of rocks, sand, and dry riverbeds where you could hide a tank division, let alone 2 men. When they reached the edge of the cliff and killed the engine, silence fell. So dense it plugged their ears. Before them lay a chaos of stone, a red-hot frying pan on which they were to live. "They won't find us here," said Hermann. "The question is whether we will survive here ourselves," replied Hens. They hid the truck under an overhanging rock, covered it with branches and stones, turning it into part of the landscape. From that moment, there was no turning back. The first weeks were euphoria. They felt like Robinsons. They found water in the dry bed of the Kaiseb River. If you dig deep, you can find wet sand. The water there is bitter, salty, but it sustains life. Carp even swam in the puddles, which they caught with their hands. But the idyll ended quickly. Meat reserves ran out. The organism, working to exhaustion in plus 145 degrees heat, demanded protein. They needed to kill something big. They saw tracks, feral cows, descendants of livestock that escaped from farms decades ago. These were not domestic cows. These were ferocious, muscular beasts used to fighting off leopards. They tracked a huge bull. It was a mountain of meat, capable of feeding them for 6 months. The plan was scientific. Henno with the shotgun and dog drives the beast down the gorge. Hermann with the Luger waits in ambush. But a plan is theory. Reality is half a ton of rage. The bull caught the scent of man. Instead of running, he turned around. He lowered his horns and charged. Imagine this moment. You are standing on a narrow path. A living battering ram is rushing at you. In your hands is a shotgun, loaded it with birdshot, which can only anger such a hulk. Henno fired. Flash, roar, smell of gunpowder. The shot hit the bull in the face, blinding him in one eye. But the animal's inertia was monstrous. Henno threw himself to the side, pressing into the rock. A horn struck the stone an inch from his hip, striking sparks. "Shoot!" screamed Henno. Hermann opened fire with the pistol. 9mm bullets entered the bull's body, but adrenaline made the animal insensitive to pain. The bull spun in place, dug the earth with hooves, bellowed. Otto, the faithful dog, rushed into battle. He latched onto the bull's nose, trying to hold him. The bull shook his head, and the dog flew onto the rocks with broken ribs. This was not a hunt. It was a dirty, bloody brawl in an alley. They ran out of ammo. The bull, bleeding out, was on his knees but still alive and dangerous. They had to get close. They had to use a knife. Slitting the throat of a huge animal is not something taught in geology school. It is heavy, sickening work. Hot blood flooded their hands, clothes, faces. The smell of stomach contents and copper hit their noses. When the bull finally went quiet, Henno and Hermann fell nearby, breathing heavily. Their hands shook so much they couldn't light a smoke. They looked at each other. There was no more romance of adventure in their eyes. There was fear. That day they realized the desert is no place for gentlemen. To survive here, you must become a predator. Killing the bull is half the battle. How do you preserve 200 kilograms of meat in an oven where the shade temperature reaches 40 degrees? A race against time, and rot began. They worked for 2 days without sleep. They cut the carcass into thin strips, the canyon filled with the sweet, sickening smell of blood. This smell attracted guests, millions of flies. They covered the meat in a black, moving carpet. They crawled into eyes, nose, mouth. Then came the jackals. At night, predator eyes glowed green around the camp. Otto, despite his wounds, barked until he was hoarse, driving away thieves. Henno and Hermann smoked the meat, salted it, dried it in the sun. They made biltong, strips of protein hard as wood. For the next 6 months, their life turned into Groundhog Day. Breakfast, jerky; lunch, bone soup; dinner, roasted meat. No vegetables, no fruit, no vitamins. They began to notice changes in their bodies. Gums became spongy and bled, the first signs of scurvy. Any scratch festered for weeks. Skin became dry and cracked. They began drinking the blood of killed animals. Fresh, warm blood, mixing it with salt. It was the only source of vitamins. At first they vomited, then they got used to it. Blood tastes like warm, metallic water. Second year of exile. They sat in the shadow of a rock, hiding from the midday sun. The sand beneath them teemed with life invisible to the eye. Hermann felt a prick in his leg. "Tick," he said, pulling off the insect. He didn't give it importance. In the desert, something is always biting you. But this tick was different. It fed on animal corpses. It was a reservoir of poison and bacteria. 3 hours later, Hermann couldn't stand up. His legs swelled and turned purple. Lymph nodes swelled to the size of a walnut. "I can't see anything," he whispered. The toxin hit the optic nerve. Sepsis began. Fever near 40. Vomiting. They were 100 kilometers from the nearest doctor. They had no antibiotics. They only had a 1940 first aid kit, bandages, alcohol, and potassium permanganate. Henno realized if he did nothing, his friend would die before sunset. "I have to cut," he said. Hermann nodded, biting his lips. Imagine this scene, a cave lit by dim light, a dirty bearded man sterilizing a knife blade over a lighter flame. Another man, half mad with fever, lies on the stones. Henno made a cross-shaped incision on the bite site. Pus and black blood gushed out. Hermann screamed but didn't pull his leg away. Henno cleaned the wound and filled it with permanganate crystals. It is a barbaric method. Permanganate burns tissues, killing infection along with flesh. The next 3 days were hell. Henno didn't sleep, changing dressings, pouring water into his friend's mouth. He listened to Hermann's delirium, talking to people who weren't there. In such moments, loneliness is felt most acutely. If Hermann dies, Henno remains alone. And then what? Dig a grave for a friend in rocky ground, and then go mad from silence. Hermann survived, but he was never the same again. His health was broken. 3rd year. Drought. The desert decided to get rid of them for good. Rains did not come. Antelopes and zebras left the canyon in search of water. They remained alone in an empty stone sack. Food ran out. Biltong eaten. Flour ran out a year ago. They started hunting anything that moved. They caught lizards, monitor lizards, snakes. An entry appeared in Henno's diary. Monitor lizard tastes like a mix of chicken and fish. If you close your eyes, you can imagine its dinner in a restaurant. They began to look like skeletons. Ribs could be counted through the skin, eyes sunken into the skull. Beriberi began, a disease from vitamin B deficiency. Hermann started losing control of his legs. Paralysis crept from the bottom up. First feet, then knees. He fell on flat ground. He couldn't hold a cup. His psyche began to crumble. He sat for hours, staring at one point. He stopped listening to the radio. He stopped reading. Henno, who was physically stronger, realized this is the finale. They defeated humans, they defeated predators, but they lost to biochemistry. They needed a doctor. They needed food. They needed prison. The paradox of survival. To not die, they had to surrender to those they fled from. March 1943. The truck, which had stood under a pile of stones for 2.5 years, looked like a pile of scrap metal, tires dried out, battery dead. But Henno was an engineer. He resuscitated the machine. He poured in the remaining gasoline, which had turned into thick sludge. They loaded the sick Hermann into the back. Otto, the old dog, covered in scars from battles with baboons and leopards, jumped in after. They drove out of the canyon. When they reached the first farms, people looked at them with horror. 2 bearded, sun-blackened men looking like biblical prophets, and a huge dog. They surrendered to the police in Windhoek. The police couldn't believe their eyes. They had searched for these dangerous Nazi spies with planes and patrols. And they lived under the police's nose, in caves, like primitive men. They were sent to the hospital. Doctors were shocked by their tests. Vitamin levels in blood were at 0. But bone and muscle density was incredible. The trial was a farce. They were accused of evading arrest, illegal hunting, weapon possession, and failure to pay dog tax. The judge, listening to their story, leafed through their diaries, looked at maps they drew in the desert. These maps were more accurate than official military maps. "You are crazy," said the judge, "but I cannot send you to prison. You have already served your term in hell." They were fined and released. But this story has a bitter aftertaste. The desert does not let its captives go just like that. Hermann Korn never fully recovered. His nervous system was destroyed. He died just a few years later, in 1946, in a stupid car accident, as if the civilization he returned to took revenge on him. Otto, the legendary dog, disappeared. One day he simply walked away from the house in Windhoek and didn't return. Henno believed the dog went to die in the desert, his real home. Henno Martin lived a long life. He became a famous geologist. He wrote the book The Sheltering Desert, which became a Bible for survivalists. Until the end of his days, he said those 900 days in the canyon were the best time of his life. A time when he was truly free. "We learn to live without hope for tomorrow," he wrote, and that is exactly what made our everyday infinitely valuable.